Next command that we'd like to go over is get checkout workshop X dash step Y. And this basically retrieves the branch WX step Y. This command basically retrieves the branch WX dash step Y from GitHub or from the cloud. And you can think of this as being very similar to like going through the version history of a Google Doc and then picking a version to restore, basically. And so this is like the exact same thing. So basically in git check out some branch, we want to check out a particular version of the code. And in the case of our workshop, we want to check out an individual step. And so now let's go into workshop 3, where we'll be going over more React and using APIs and also do some routing. So previously in workshop 2, you guys made a profile page in React, and you guys made the components and also defined the states and props. And from lecture today, you learned what an API is and what HTTP requests are, and also may have briefly touched upon asynchronous programming. And so in this workshop today, we'll be interacting with an API from the front end. And so what that means is we'll be making GET requests and also POST requests. More specifically, we'll be building front end for retrieving and making posts and comments for catalogs. And so just like a brief review of like what front end and back end is. So if you as a user, like you're browsing the web and you browse like, say you're browsing like catbook.com and you like look at the UI and like what you see displayed on your screen. And the code that's responsible for like everything that you see on the screen or like what's displayed on your screen is what we call the front end. And so the front end is code responsible for displaying what is in front of you. The front end, since its main job is just displaying, it just takes information from like some like entity, right? And sometimes it may also like send updated information from like the user, from you typing on the computer or whatnot, to the unknown brain entity. So like the brain of the application is like, and the front end includes things like React components, HTML, CSS, etc. Going back, the brain of the application or web application is the front end. The front end is just like a dummy thing that's like taking in information and displaying it, and also like taking any new information from the user and sending it to some like brain of the application. And this brain is what we call the server. And it's like the back end. And the code of the server is called the back end, where it's like working behind the scenes and it's responsible for giving the front end information it needs to display and updating like any new information that it gets from the front end. And so you may be thinking, well, like front end and back end, they seem to be talking a lot, but how exactly do they communicate? And they communicate in what is called like HTTP requests. And as Kong mentioned, there's like 2 main types of HTTP requests that we'll be using in this class. The first kind is a GET request, which is where the front end asks the back end, say, hey, give me information on something, something. And in response, the back end will say, hey, here's information that you requested on this something, something. And the second type of HTTP request that we'll be using is what we call a POST request. This is where the front end tells the back end, say, hey, here's some new information on this something, something, something. And then with the new information, the back end will like do something, like maybe it will make some computations, maybe it will make some updates, et cetera, et cetera. And in this case, there's really no need for like the back end to like send another response. So usually in POST request, there's like no response from it. And so here's like a summary of like everything. And so how does the front end specify like what kind of information it wants? And how does it specify like what kind of information it's giving to the back end? So this is where the API endpoint comes in. The API endpoint is a specification of like inputs and outputs. It's where it specifies what kind of information the front end wants from the back end, and also specifies what kind of information the front end will be giving to the back end, depending on if the request is a GET or a POST request. And so a more concrete example is if we take an API endpoint, say /stories. And so if we have the get /stories, the front end may tell the back end, hey, give me all of the stories that you have. And in response, the back end will say, hey, here's all the stories I have for you to display on the front end side of your application. And in the context of the POST request for post/stories, the front end may tell the back end, hey, here's a new story. And the back end will do whatever it needs to do with that new story, maybe add it to a database, which we'll be covering in Friday's lecture. But in this lecture, in this workshop, we'll only be focusing on the front end side. So what this means is we'll only be just making these posts and these GET requests, and also taking the response from this back end and kind of like incorporating it into our website and making it prettier. Like the specifics of like how we're getting that data and what we're doing with that new story or new data, new information is like something that we'll be leaving to tomorrow. So today we're just going to be making these posts and GET requests from the front end and using the response to update our website and kind of display information on Capbook. And so with that, let's review like the flow of an HTTP request from the front end side. So let's say we want to make a GET request from the front end, and we're making it to an API, like say it's /stories. And as a response, we get that data in the following format. And with this data, the front end then kind of renders it into a component and makes it into a such that it's pretty in some sense, right? It's like more readable and usable than like whatever this kind of JSON data. And this is exactly what we're trying to do today. We're going to make GET requests and POST requests. But like in a GET request, we're going to make a GET request, get the data, and render the data such that it is user-friendly. And so let's get started. If everyone can navigate to Capbook React repo, get reset --hard, and check out workshop 3 starter branch, and also npm install. Okay. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to put them on our question doc. And if you need any individual help, feel free to put yourself on the queue and one of our staff members will help. Good. Yes. Okay. So if you look into our repo, you can see that it has a similar folder structure to Workshop 2's folder structure, except there's a new file, which is utilities.js. We have utilities.js, and as mentioned in a previous lecture, we have a GET method and also a POST method, which is basically a staff implemented method that implements a GET request to an endpoint and a POST request to an endpoint. And you can make your own GET and POST requests, but we just made these for your guys' convenience. And these will also be included in the skeleton that you guys will be getting for your own app. But yes. Okay. Okay. And so if you recall the component hierarchy from where we ended off from workshop 2, we have a profile page, and inside the profile page, we have a cat happiness component. And after today's workshop, or workshop 3, we'll be adding 2 new pages, a not found page and a feed page. It has a lot of new components, such as the card, new story, single story, comments box, single comment, new comment. And basically, we're just going to be implementing like a posting system where you can post and you can also comment under each post. So our goals for today then is to implement this feed page. And we want to be able to see other posts and comments using a GET request. And we want to be able to make our own posts and comments using a post request. And we'll also be doing some front-end routing because we have so many new pages. We don't just have one page. So front-end routing will allow us to be able to navigate through multiple pages. So let's go. So if everyone can run npm run hot loader, note this is the command to run your front end. It's not npm start, it's npm run hot loader. And so in the browser, head to localhost 5050, and it should look a lot like where we ended off from workshop 2. And as a warm-up, if everyone can go in app.js, import feed.js, and also render feed instead of profile. You guys, so we're going to pages. And instead of rendering profile, instead of returning profile inside app container, we want to return. Right. And if we go to, we'll see that we do indeed get the feed. Okay. Make this bigger. Okay. So here I've just commented out profile, added feed, and imported feed. Everyone good? Good. Oh. So our next step then, if everyone can just follow along with me, is questions. Now, as always, to catch up, run git reset --hi and git checkout workshop 3 step 1. So step 1 is where we'll be coding together. And this is where we'll be getting stories on the front end. So we'll actually be making a GET request to get all of our stories. And so our endpoint is the /API/stories, and it returns all of the stories, and there's no parameters that you need to provide for it. And the method that will be helpful later on is JSON.stringify. And so this basically makes like a list of JavaScript objects renderable, because JavaScript by itself can't, or React by itself can't render JavaScript objects. You need to turn it into like a string, and this basically just turns a list of JavaScript objects into strings so that it can be renderable. So if we go into feed.js and get stories, we're going to first hold the stories in our state. So we go to us. Let's first define a state to hold stories. So to define a state, we want to do const, and let's call it stories, and our setter method to be set stories. Okay, and then to define a state, we want to just use the useState method. And since we want the state to store all of our stories, it makes sense to have the data type be a list. And since we don't have any stories for now, we'll just initialize it to be an empty list. And then our next step is to get stories in useEffect. So inside useEffect, we want to use the get method that we provided in utilities.js, and then set our story state to contain all of the stories from our get request. And so let's first use our get method. So recall that our get helper function basically takes in the endpoint. And in our case, the endpoint is /API/stories. And optionally, it also takes in some parameters, but since our API for stories does not require any parameters, we can just leave it blank. So let's first have the get request, and let's specify the endpoint /API/stories. And since JavaScript is an asynchronous function, as mentioned in the lecture today, we can't directly just set this to like, let's say like a story response and then do set stories. So this is not correct, because since it's asynchronous, it's possible that line 15 runs before line 14. So we want to make sure that this set stories, this line, runs only after the get request finishes. And to ensure that, we need to use the dot then. And this dot then takes in a callback function. And what a callback function is that it basically means that whatever this function is, this function will be executed only after this get request finishes. And this takes in as an input whatever we get from this API response, and it is a list of story objects. And we want to set our state to be whatever this response is. Questions? So to reiterate, basically this dot then is just saying only after I finish my get request do I set my story state to be this response that I get from this get request. So I'm not going to set the stories like before it ensures that you're not setting your story state before your get request finishes. So this is like the format that we'll be using quite often for, at least in this course. It's basically just a request get or post request, usually a get request, and then dot then. And then inside the dot then, you want a function that's basically whatever function you want to run after the get request finishes. And the parameter to the function is whatever you get back from the response. And then usually it's just setting the state, but sometimes it can be other things. Good questions. Okay. And so the next step we want to do is to actually render these stories, the list of stories. And as mentioned before, these story objects, this story objects is a list of JavaScript objects, so we can't directly render them. And so basically to render them, we need to use the JSON.stringify, and recall that to add JavaScript to your React, you need to use curly braces, and inside the curly braces, we do JSON.stringify, and then we say it's because we want to output our story state, and our story state is a list of JavaScript objects, and this thing makes it renderable or able to be displayed on our site. And so if you go, so this then you can see is the list of all of the JavaScript objects that we got as a response from our GET request, right? So this is like a list of all of the individual posts that we got as a response, all of the individual stories. So you should see something similar to this. If we go back to the code. Yes. Okay. Does anyone need more time? Raise your hand if you need more time, or you're good. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Thumbs up. Okay, cool. Okay. Okay. So again, you should be seeing something similar to this, which we did. And if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it on the question doc. And as always, to catch up, run get reset -- hard and check out workshop 3, step 2. And so step 2 is going to be your guys' turn. And so in feed.js, import single story.js and render a single story component. And recall that single story, it takes in 2 props. So one prop is the name and one prop is the content, right? Or sorry, creator name and the content. So you want to pass these 2 in as a prop to single story. And you want to do that in feed.js. Okay. Can everyone give me a thumbs up if you're ready to move on? Otherwise, maybe a couple more minutes. Okay, thumbs up if you're ready. No, okay. Okay. Um. So let's do this together. So if we go into feed.js, the first thing we want to do is to import single story. And we want to specify where the single story file is. And if we look in the folder structure, we're in feed right now. And single story is in the modules folder, which is like, we have to go out of pages. So to go out of pages, the pages folder, we do a dot dot. So now we're in the components folder. And then to go into the single story file, we want to go into the modules folder. And then inside modules, you can find single stories. Let me pull in. And then the next thing we want to do is to add single story and render, basically just render single story instead of this JSON.stringify. So we can delete that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write single story here. And note that single story takes in 2 props. And to pass in props, all you need to do is, so if you look, single story has 2 props, right? Creator name and content. To pass in props, all you need to do is to say the name of the prop. So in this case, one of the prop is creator name. And you set it equal to a value. And in this case, because we know that creator name is a string, we set it to a string. And in my case, I'll set it to Helen. And the second prop that single story takes then is content. And to pass it in, we do the same thing. We take the content or the name of the prop and we paste it here. And we let it be equal to whatever value we want it to be equal to. And let's say for me, I like metas. And you might notice that this will probably not render. Yes, the rendering is in the next step. But if we were actually going to use the creator name, say if we're going to use, say, instead of saying this is a single story, if we outputted the creator name, this will not work. And this is because when we are using props, we need to actually pass it into this method, this single story method. So you actually need to write props here. And so this will then be able to render. Right. So make sure whenever you're passing in props, you want to include props as a parameter to the component. So make sure to include props. Okay. All right. So now we have our like single story. We have a single story in our feed. Now what we want to do is to actually make use of the creator and the content props that we passed in. And we also want it to be pretty. In single story.js, we're going to make the stories prettier. And we're going to do that using the CSS classes card story, the bold utility class, and card story content. And these cards CSS classes are located in the card.css file in modules. So you want to import that in your single stories.js. And you want it to look something like this. So the first thing you'd want to do is probably import the card.css file and try to play around with just like ending the creator name and also the content, right? And remember to access the prop, the value of the prop in your single story component. What you want to do is you want to do props dot whatever the name of the prop is. So you want to do either props dot creator name or props dot content to access either one of them. And so try to use these CSS classes to render the creator name and the content into something like this. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to add yourself to the queue or add a question onto the question box. Or raise your hand. Okay, let's go through this together. So let's go through single story. And again, the first step we want to do is to import card.css. And if we look in our folder, card.css is in the modules folder. And right now, single stories is also in the module folder. So all we need to do is to import our and then the next thing we want to do is to actually render the creator name and the content. So what we can do is to maybe first we want a div for the creator name. And so our class name, kind of going off of the classes that we want to use, is going to be probably the bold utility class, since if you notice, this name is slightly bolded. And we also have a card story content, which seems to imply that this div, this like whatever the content is, that div will have a class of the cards. And the card story class is already being used here. So let's just do old class, and let's put the creator name inside. And again, as a reminder, whenever you want to include JavaScript code into your React component to be rendered, you want to use curly braces. And inside the curly braces, to get the value of the prop, you want to do props dot name of the prop, and in this case, we want to do creator name. Let's check. See. If we do. Maybe this will work. So, we have a name, our creator name, and it's bolded, kind of like what we see in the slide here. And so the next step is to include the story content. And to do that, let's add another div or another box. And we will, inside that box, we want to include the story content. And so basically, we just want to use props.content because that is the name of the prop that is passed in. And for the class name, again, just looking back at the slide, we want to use the class name dash story. This is approximately correct. More or less matching whatever is here. Go back to the code. So as a recap, basically what I did here was I used the value, or I rendered the value of the props by adding curly braces, and inside the curly braces to use the value of props, you do props dot whatever the name of the prop is. In this case, it's creator name, and then props dot content. And for each of these boxes or each of these like divs, I used a different CSS class, which resulted in different fonts and like font sizes that you see here. And so as you can see, just by like changing the CSS, you can change a lot of like what a website looks like or like how things look. And so CSS is pretty powerful. Okay. Moving on, let's go to step 3. So now that we have a single story component defined, let's actually map each of the JavaScript objects, which corresponds to like a story, into a single story component, right? So instead of rendering like a list of JavaScript objects, we instead want to render a list of single story components, where each single story component corresponds to one of the objects in the story's state array, right? And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. And to catch up, run git reset -- hard and git checkout workshop 3 step 3. Questions? Yes. So for step 3 in feed.js, again, we want to put our state and single story together. Essentially what this means is our state is a list of JavaScript objects where each object corresponds to like information about a single post in our Kafka. And we want to turn each of those like information blocks into an actual like pretty renderable JavaScript or React component. And in that case, we want to use our single story component. And basically, since we have like a one-to-one mapping between like each JavaScript object in our state and a single story component, we want to use what we call a map function in JavaScript. So what the map function does is it creates a new array and basically applying a function to every element of the starting array. So if we take an example of like a list of JavaScript objects on this left-hand side, what the map function does is given like a function that we give it. So the map function takes in a function as an input. And so for each of these components, each of these elements in the original array, we apply this provided function and we output something, another element, right? And so in this case, in our case, we want to apply a function that turns each story object in our state into a single story component in React. And yes, as said before, React can't render JavaScript objects, but it can render components, React components. So we want to end up with something like this. So let's go into feed.js. Everyone can follow along. So here we want to return a list of single story components. So to do that, let's first define a stories. And let us map. So the map function works as follows. You first specify the array you want to map, and then you do dot map. And then inside this map function, you specify the function that will be called on every single element of the original array. And in this case, this function will be applied onto every element of the stories array. Right. So then in this case, then the input of this function is a singular story object. It's a singular element of the stories array. And we want to return a single story component for each of these story objects. And if we go back and look at like how the story object array is formatted, it basically stores the creator name and also the content of the story. So what we can do is we can just pass those in as props. So recall here in the single story, how we passed in the creator name and the content as prop is to just specify the props that we want to pass in. So for creator name, we specify it. And in this case, since it's a JavaScript object, we want to do story object dot creator name. Right, because we can't directly use like a string, we need to use a JavaScript code to like represent whatever is stored inside the story object. Because why we need curly braces. And so similarly for the content, we want to specify the prop that we want to pass. And then this equals to the value that we want to pass, which is story object dot content. And so instead of returning a single like dummy single story, we then just want to return the stories. And because it is a JavaScript code, we want to use curly braces and input it as right. Oh. So again, to recap, the map function takes in a function as input. And what it does is it applies this input function onto every element of the original array. And it returns, the map function returns an array where every single element in the returned array is every single element in the array with the function applied onto it. And so in this case, we want to map every single JavaScript object corresponding to a story into a single story component. And we do that defining a single story component for each of the story objects, where we pass in the creator name and the content of the story object as props into the single story. Okay. And if we go here, we can then see that each of the JavaScript objects are indeed mapped into a single story object, right? So, okay. Moving on. There might be some cases where maybe you don't have any stories. As a result, we want to declare that there's no stories. So to do that, we can just add a conditional on the stories list. So let's just first have a conditional on the length of the story. So we can do if stories dot length equals to 0, then we first declare. And so if stories length equals to 0, then let's just declare our stories list to be equal to the component. Just saying no stories. If we do have stories, we can do what we did before and basically map the stories objects into single stories, right? So basically in this step, we're just adding a conditional on the length of our stories array. So basically it's just saying that if we don't have any stories, we just want to show to our users that we don't have any stories, right? Because if we directly just output the stories list when we don't have any stories, it would just be an empty page. And I guess that's not very informative for the users because they might think that something might be broken, where in fact, we just don't have any stories. Okay. Questions? As always, to catch up, run git reset -- hard and git checkout workshop 3 - step 4. So the previous few steps was get requests. So now let's work on a post request, and this will be the last step of the day. So our post API endpoint will be /API/stories. And basically it takes in a parameter called content, which is just whatever the content of the new story is. And so if we can all follow along for step 4, let's go to the file new post input. And we're going to make a component that can actually post stories. And so this component is what we call the new story component. And we're going to be using this new story component in our feed.js. Now let's go step by step and first go into new post input. But if we look in new post input, we actually already have a component that basically is like a text box for like users to use, right? And it takes in a on submit function as a prop. Essentially, what this means is that when we pass in a function, this function will be called whenever this text box is submitted. And so we can just use this new post input component, our new story component. And the only thing we need to do is to specify a function to call when we want to submit our story, right? Because technically we can also reuse this new post input when we're making comments, right? The only difference is that the function that we pass in to the as a prompt to the component would be different because the post request that we're making would be different, right? And so first, let's just define like the function that we want to call when we submit our story, right? And let's call that add story. So if we do const add story equals to, and if you notice here, the on submit function takes in a story ID and a value. But I think we can just ignore the story ID and just submit the value. So it takes in a value, and this is not. It takes in a value, and this value is essentially what's like the content of the content of the text box. So if we look back into the handle submit button here, essentially what we want to do is we want to submit whatever value is in the text box as a post request, right? And like send it up to like this imaginary server. And so that input is going to be this value. Oh, sorry, this value. And braces. Okay. And so when we want to send a post request, we want to have a body. So let's define a body. And looking at the API here, the body, inside the body, we want the content to have like a key like content, right? Like this parameter that we're passing in is called content. So inside this parameter, we want it called content. And the value of this content is whatever value that is passed in to this add story function. And so this is basically the information that this front end is going to send up to like this imaginary, like this like server, right? So like for this workshop, our server is like kind of black boxed. So like we're just sending it to like a server. And what we want to do then is to make a post request that allows us to send this body to the server. So we're going to make a post request. And as always, when you make a post or a GET request, you want to specify the endpoint. And so our endpoint is /API/stories. And our parameter is the body. And that is it. Okay, so this add story basically is just called whenever anyone presses the submit button for the text box. So when they want to submit the post, they this takes like the value of the input and it sends it up to the server and in a post request, right? So we're just saying like from our like front end, we're saying, hey, here's like a new story that I want you to like update your internal state or whatever. And so the next step of this new story component is to render it, right? Return something that's like renderable. And as mentioned before, we want to reuse this new post input component And so we're going to do that by specifying here. So we're going to return a new post. And again, this new post input takes in the onSubmit function as a prop. And so to pass in props, again, we're going to take the name of this prop and we put it inside the component and we set it equal to whatever we want to pass in. And in this case, we want to pass in the add story function. Questions about how this works? So basically what's happening here is why we only need to define a function and why it works with just the value is because the HTML in React and JavaScript, the on-click handle submit, this function basically what it does is it takes in the value of the input text box input as a parameter, and then it does whatever is inside the function, right? So by default, it takes in the value of the input box as a parameter. So that is the definition of what happens with the onSubmit. And as a result, because we already defined the input and the input text box and the input submit button, all we really need to do now is to define what happens when we want to submit. And when we want to submit, the only thing we want to do is to send a post request to the API/stories endpoint to kind of update and say that here is the new story that I have for you to the server. Okay. And so now that we have our new story component defined, what we want to do is we want to add this component into our feed. We want to be able to make new stories. And to do that, we need to add it to our return in our feed. And so by default, usually you return things in React in one line, but you can actually return multi-line code. And to do that, you want to use parentheses, and then you want to add whatever you want to return inside the parentheses. This will allow for multi-line, right? And then, so now you can see that I have the multi-line, return that spans multiple lines. And so the first thing that we want to render is the new story component, which we first need to import. So we want to import new story. This new post input. And the reason I'm putting this new story in curly braces and not the single stories in curly braces is if you go into the new post input, you can see that there's multiple things being exported. So as a result, to specify what you want to import from this new post input file, you need to add curly braces. And so now that we've imported the new story component, all we need to do is to add it into our return statement to render it. And we also want to render the list of stories. So if you see here, we do have a submit button. And yeah, it seems like a lot of you guys got it. So if you type something in, let's say hi web lab 2023 and you submit it, it should pop up at the bottom. So as a recap for this step, basically what we did was we took this new post input component and reused it in our new story component. And we reused it by defining a method that will be called whenever the submit button is clicked. And this function in this new story case makes a post request to the /API/story such that the server is updated with a content of like a news story. And then inside feed, what we did was we imported the news story component and then we just rendered it inside a return statement. And to make a multi-line component or like rendered or return, you can just add regular parentheses to enclose whatever you want to return. Because if you don't have these parentheses, it will probably complain. Yeah. And so notice that in like the as store, when we made a post request, we didn't need a promise because we weren't waiting for like the post request to finish. Like we weren't waiting for a response to come back. Right. So usually in like web apps, for post requests, you usually just make a post request and you just send that new information away. Right? Like you only really need the .then and get request when you want to like be able to get the information from the get request. So you want to make sure that you have the information before doing anything. But in a post request, since you're just sending information out to the server, you don't really need to like have a .then. Okay. As always, if you have any questions, please ask. In like the next half of this workshop, which we'll be doing tomorrow, you guys will be doing something very, very similar to these first 4 steps. So yes, do ask. And to catch up, as always, run get reset --hard and get check out workshop 3-step. And as a reminder, we have a Git guide and we also have React practice. And also a reminder that milestone 0 is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. That's it for today. We'll be continuing this workshop tomorrow.